A hit single only ever tells part of the story. Behind every chart topper sits a stack of studio sessions, B-sides, and album filler that most listeners never think twice about. And even the most celebrated bands in history have a few recordings they'd honestly rather leave buried in the vault. So today, we're counting down the Beatles, 12 terrible flops you've never heard. Number 12, Little Child by the Beatles, tucked away on the band's second studio album With the Beatles. Released in November 1963, to enormous anticipation from fans still riding the wave of Beatlemania, this fast-paced rocker was written mainly by John Lennon, with some help from Paul McCartney, reportedly composed as filler material simply needed to round out the album's finished track listing in time for release. The song has long been considered one of the weaker entries in the Beatles' early catalog, built around a fairly simple, repetitive lyrical premise and a somewhat forced harmonica-driven arrangement that never quite reaches the genuine energy of the band's stronger, more memorable rock and roll numbers recorded during that same early period of their career. Lennon himself later dismissed the song rather bluntly in interviews, admitting it had been written quickly and without much real inspiration behind it, purely as a way to fill out the record before its deadline. The recording features Lennon on harmonica, an instrument that had already become something of a signature sound across the band's earliest singles like Love Me Do and Please Please Me. Though here on this particular track, it feels more like a leftover stylistic habit than any genuine, considered creative decision. With the Beatles itself sold extremely well upon its original release, reaching number 1 on the UK albums chart within days and staying there for months, which only made a comparatively weak filler track, like this one, blend even further into the background of an otherwise wildly commercially successful record. It has rarely been performed or referenced since its original release, and it remains one of the least discussed tracks from the band's early years, overshadowed almost entirely by the album's more memorable singles and covers. Number 11, Mr. Moonlight by the Beatles.
Moonlight.
Originally written by American songwriter Roy Lee Johnson and recorded by the Atlanta group Dr. Feelgood and the Interns back in 1962, this cover version appeared on the Beatles' fourth studio album, Beatles for Sale, released in December 1964, right in the middle of the band's most demanding touring and recording schedule to date. Respected Beatles historian Mark Lewisohn has described it as most people's least favorite song on the entire record, and critics have been remarkably consistent in their harsh assessment over the decades since its release, with one prominent music writer going so far as to call it arguably the worst thing the group ever recorded across their entire career together. Much of the lingering criticism centers specifically on Paul McCartney's Hammond organ solo, often described by writers as sounding closer to a roller skating rink than a serious rock recording, layered somewhat awkwardly beneath John Lennon's famously strained, shouted vocal delivery throughout the track.
And from the world you sent my girl.
Despite the near-universal panning from critics over the decades, the band had actually performed the song live for years before ever recording it in the studio, suggesting the four of them genuinely enjoyed playing it live, even if the eventual studio version never quite managed to capture that same raw energy. The song had actually been a genuine staple of the band's live set list during their grueling residencies at Hamburg's Star Club and Liverpool's Cavern Club years earlier in their career, suggesting the eventual studio version simply failed to translate the same raw, sweaty energy that live audiences had responded to so enthusiastically in person night after night. The Hollies, a rival British band rising through the same Merseybeat-adjacent scene at the time, also recorded their own separate version of the song for their debut album around that same period, though neither rendition ever quite managed to escape the song's lingering reputation as an awkward relic of an earlier, less sophisticated musical era. It remains, by wide consensus among fans and critics alike, one of the most frequently cited low points of the Beatles' entire recorded output.
Mr. Moonlight.
Number 10, What Goes On by the Beatles.
What goes on in your mind?
Featured on the widely celebrated 1965 album Rubber Soul, an album many critics consider a turning point in the band's artistic development, this country-tinged track marked one of the rare occasions where Ringo Starr received an official co-writing credit alongside Lennon and McCartney, though the bulk of the song had actually been written years earlier by Lennon alone before being reworked and finished specifically for the new album. Starr took the lead vocal himself, delivering the song in a laid-back, twangy country style that stood in sharp, almost jarring contrast to the far more sophisticated songwriting appearing everywhere else on the same record, from Norwegian Wood to In My Life. Because Rubber Soul is so widely regarded by critics and music historians alike as a major creative leap forward for the entire band, this comparatively simple, throwback-sounding track has often been viewed as something of a step backward for the album as a whole.
The other day I saw you as I walked along the road.
Included mainly to give Starr his customary one lead vocal spot per record, rather than out of any particular artistic ambition on the rest of the band's part. The track was recorded in November 1965 during the very same intensive sessions that also produced far more celebrated, groundbreaking songs like Norwegian Wood and In My Life, making its comparatively simple three-chord structure stand out even more sharply against the far more ambitious material surrounding it on the finished record. It has rarely been highlighted in serious retrospectives of the album, typically mentioned only briefly in passing as the least essential entry on an otherwise widely celebrated genre-defining record. The track was recorded in a single session on November 4th, 1965, one of the last songs completed before the album's tight December deadline, giving it something of a rushed, last-minute quality compared to the more carefully crafted material surrounding it.
What goes on in your mind?
Number 9, Flying by the Beatles. Appearing on the Magical Mystery Tour project released in December 1967, right on the heels of the far more acclaimed Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, this brief instrumental track holds the unusual distinction of being the only Beatles recording ever credited to all 4 band members as co-writers, a genuine rarity in a catalog otherwise almost entirely dominated by the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. Built around a simple, repetitive melody and featuring some added mellotron textures layered together with backward tape effects, the track was originally conceived purely as incidental background music, intended to accompany footage of clouds drifting by during the Magical Mystery Tour television film. Critics and fans alike have generally regarded it as one of the most forgettable tracks the band ever officially released, lacking the structure, melody, or ambition found in virtually everything else in their catalog from that same creative era of their career. The track was originally recorded under the fittingly literal working title, Aerial Tour Instrumental, during sessions held in September 1967, and it stands today as the shortest official Beatles recording ever released under the band's own name, clocking in at just over 2 minutes from start to finish. Despite its unusual songwriting credit, shared equally among all 4 members, the track has rarely been mentioned in retrospectives of the band's work, largely overshadowed by the far more ambitious material surrounding it on the same release. Number 8, The Inner Light by the Beatles.
Without going out of my door.
Released in March 1968 as the B-side to the single Lady Madonna, this George Harrison composition marked the very first time one of Harrison's own songs appeared on either the A-side or B-side of an official Beatles single, a genuine milestone for his songwriting career within the band that nonetheless went largely unnoticed at the time, given the song's more modest placement as a B-side rather than a proper single release in its own right. The lyrics were adapted almost directly from a specific passage in the ancient Chinese text, the Tao Te Ching, reflecting Harrison's rapidly deepening interest in Eastern philosophy and spirituality at the time, and the entire instrumental backing track was recorded by a group of Indian classical musicians in Bombay, with Harrison adding his own vocals separately once he returned to London. Because it was tucked away as a B-side rather than released as its own standalone single, the song remained largely unknown even to fairly dedicated longtime fans for years afterward, thoroughly overshadowed by Lady Madonna's far larger commercial presence, chart performance, and steady radio airplay at the time of its original release in early 1968. The backing track was recorded in Bombay in January 1968 using many of the very same accomplished Indian classical musicians Harrison had already worked with on his own solo soundtrack album Wonderwall Music just months earlier, giving the song an unusually authentic instrumental texture compared to the more Western-influenced sitar experiments the Beatles had attempted on earlier records, like Rubber Soul and Revolver. It has since come to be appreciated by some critics and dedicated fans as an underrated example of Harrison's steadily growing songwriting confidence during this stretch of the band's career, though it remains, even now, one of the most genuinely obscure tracks anywhere in the band's entire official catalog. Number 7. What's the New Mary Jane by the Beatles?
What a shame Mary Jane had to pay it at the party.
Written by John Lennon during the band's now famous meditation retreat in Rishikesh, India in early 1968, this deeply strange track was recorded that August with only Lennon and George Harrison actually performing on the finished take, joined by Yoko Ono and longtime road manager Mal Evans contributing various sound effects and unconventional instruments to the arrangement. Considered quite seriously for inclusion on the White Album right up until the very final mixing and sequencing stage, the song was ultimately dropped at the last possible minute due to time constraints on what was already shaping up to be a sprawling, nearly overstuffed double record, and Lennon spent much of the following year trying unsuccessfully to have it released instead as a single credited to the Plastic Ono Band, a plan that was quietly scrapped once the other three Beatles found out what he had been planning. The track remained completely unreleased and largely unheard by the general public outside of scattered bootleg recordings for nearly 30 years afterward.
Mary Jane, what a shame Mary Jane had to pay it at the party.
Only finally seeing an official sanctioned release on the archival compilation Anthology 3 in 1996, nearly 3 decades after it was first recorded. An earlier, more conventional acoustic demo of the song had been recorded back in May 1968 at George Harrison's home in Esher during the informal, relaxed sessions that produced early sketches of many eventual White Album tracks. And that particular demo eventually surfaced publicly for the first time on the White Album's 50th anniversary box, set reissue released in 2018. Even by the standards of the band's more experimental work elsewhere in the same era, the song has been widely described by critics as one of the strangest and most difficult recordings in their entire catalog, built around a nursery rhyme-like melody buried beneath layers of chaotic avant-garde sound effects that grow more disorienting the longer the track runs.
She'd like to be married with Yeti.
Number 6. Wild Honey Pie by the Beatles. clocking in at under a minute in length. This brief, deliberately rough-sounding recording appeared on the sprawling White Album, released in November 1968 as the band's first release on their own newly formed Apple Records label, and was performed entirely by Paul McCartney working alone, with every single instrument recorded by him personally during one largely improvised late-night session. McCartney has explained in later interviews that the track began almost entirely as a joke, a quick home-style recording made simply to amuse the other band members during a break from more serious work. And he was reportedly genuinely surprised when it ended up included on the finished album at all, rather than being quietly discarded. Because of its brevity and its intentionally unpolished, almost childlike quality. The track has often been cited by critics and casual fans alike as one of the most inessential, skippable pieces of music the band ever officially released under their own name. The title itself was apparently inspired directly by the name of another, far more polished White Album track called Honey Pie, with McCartney simply adding the word wild in front of it to distinguish this looser, far more chaotic companion piece from its more carefully arranged namesake elsewhere on the same double album. Unlike many of the White Album's other short interludes, which tend to connect surrounding tracks or serve some structural purpose, this one stands largely on its own, making it easy for even dedicated listeners to overlook entirely. Number 5. Revolution 9 by the Beatles.
Number 9.
Also featured on the sprawling White Album, this nearly 8-minute sound collage grew out of an extended jam session that ran even longer in its original form, and it was assembled primarily by John Lennon with significant creative input from his new partner Yoko Ono, built almost entirely from layered tape loops, spoken word fragments, and orchestral snippets, rather than any conventional musical structure of verses and choruses that listeners could actually sing along to. Ringo Starr and George Harrison reportedly had little to no direct involvement in the track's creation, and Paul McCartney was said to be firmly against its inclusion on the finished album entirely, viewing the piece as far too experimental and alienating for what was still, at its core, a mainstream Beatles release meant for a wide, general listening audience, rather than an art house crowd. The track has remained one of the single most divisive pieces in the band's entire catalog ever since its release. Regularly appearing on lists ranking the worst or most unlistenable Beatles recordings, even as some music historians and avant-garde enthusiasts have separately praised it as a genuinely bold, boundary-pushing artistic statement that was decades ahead of its time. The track was assembled largely from a repeating tape loop of an EMI engineer's voice calmly repeating the phrase, "Number 9," over and over, layered together with orchestral snippets lifted from entirely unrelated recordings, backward vocal chants pulled from earlier Beatles sessions, and various spoken word fragments contributed by Yoko Ono herself, creating a genuinely disorienting listening experience unlike absolutely anything else found anywhere in the band's official catalog. Because of its length and avant-garde nature, it remains the Beatles track most frequently skipped by casual listeners working their way through the White Album, ensuring that a huge portion of even devoted fans have simply never made it all the way through.
Number 9.
Number 4. You Know My Name, Look Up the Number by the Beatles.
You know my name.
Recorded across several scattered sessions beginning in May 1967 during the immediate aftermath of Sgt. Pepper's release and not fully completed until April 1969. This bizarre music hall novelty number finally saw official release as the B-side to the band's final British single, Let It Be, in March 1970, nearly 3 full years after work on it. First began back in a very different, more optimistic creative era for the group. Built around a single repeated phrase that Lennon reportedly spotted printed on an old telephone directory sitting on Paul McCartney's piano, the track features a chaotic mix of silly cartoon voices, sound effects, and a saxophone solo contributed by the Rolling Stones' own Brian Jones, all set to a loose, Latin-tinged rhythm unlike anything else in the Beatles' catalog.
Good evening. You know my name?
Plans to release the song earlier as a standalone single credited to the Plastic Ono Band were scrapped in late 1969, delaying its eventual release even further and ensuring it finally reached record store shelves only after the band had already effectively broken up behind the scenes. It remains one of only 4 Beatles recordings ever released, out of their entire catalog, that never received an official stereo mix, existing solely in its original mono form for reasons the band and their engineers never fully explained to the public, alongside similarly mono-only early tracks like Love Me Do, despite being tucked away as a throwaway B-side on their very last UK single. Paul McCartney later named it as his personal favorite Beatles recording, precisely because of how gleefully strange and unguarded it sounds compared to almost everything else in their catalog.
You know my name.
Number 3, Old Brown Shoe by the Beatles. Written entirely by George Harrison and released in May 1969 as the B-side to the single The Ballad of John and Yoko, this bluesy rocker has remained one of the most consistently overlooked tracks Harrison ever contributed to the entire Beatles catalog, even among fans who consider themselves fairly thorough listeners. Recorded during the busy, often chaotic sessions surrounding the making of Abbey Road, the song features some of Harrison's most technically ambitious guitar work of that entire era, though it was largely overshadowed at the time by its far more commercially prominent A-side, which documented John and Yoko's recent wedding in vivid, sometimes controversial detail and became a genuine hit single in its own right. Because B-sides rarely received anywhere near the same promotional attention or radio airplay as the singles they accompanied, this particular track remained relatively unknown to casual fans for decades afterward, surfacing mainly on compilation albums released well after the band had already gone their separate ways. The song was recorded across several separate sessions, stretching from February all the way through April 1969, overlapping with the far more demanding work being done on Abbey Road at the same time. And Harrison later admitted candidly in interviews that he wasn't entirely satisfied with the final released version, feeling the finished recording never quite captured the raw energy and drive he had originally envisioned for the track when he first wrote it. Harrison himself later expressed some genuine fondness for the recording nonetheless, considering it an underappreciated example of his growing songwriting confidence during a period when Lennon and McCartney's contributions still dominated the overwhelming majority of the band's official single releases, leaving Harrison very few chances to place his own material front and center. Number 2, Dig It by the Beatles. Featured in a heavily edited 50-second form on the Let It Be album, released in May 1970, this loose, largely improvised jam session was built around Ringo Starr's steady, unhurried drumming and a rambling, semi-spoken vocal delivery from John Lennon, referencing a chaotic, seemingly random list of unrelated cultural figures and topics as he went, seemingly making it up as he went along. The full, unedited jam session reportedly ran for well over 12 sprawling minutes during the January 1969 sessions, captured on film for the Let It Be documentary and its accompanying album, recorded during the same famously tense, often exhausting weeks that also produced the band's celebrated rooftop concert atop the Apple Corps building. But producer Phil Spector trimmed it down dramatically for the final commercial release, leaving listeners with only a brief, disjointed fragment that many longtime fans found more confusing than genuinely entertaining.
Like a rolling stone.
Because the released version feels so incomplete and unstructured compared to virtually every other Beatles track, it has often been cited by critics as one of the weakest and least essential inclusions on the entire Let It Be album. The original, far longer jam session reportedly touched on a rambling stream of consciousness list of unrelated topics and public figures as Lennon improvised off the top of his head, including passing references to figures like actress Doris Day and legendary football manager Matt Busby, none of which survived into the drastically shortened 50-second version that eventually reached record store shelves around the world. It remains one of the least analyzed and least discussed pieces in the band's entire official catalog to this day, frequently skipped over entirely, even in detailed retrospectives covering their final, difficult studio sessions together before the eventual breakup.
Dig it, dig it, dig it.
Number 1, Maggie Mae by the Beatles.
Oh, dirty Maggie Mae.
Also appearing on the Let It Be album in an extremely truncated form lasting barely 40 seconds, this traditional Liverpool folk song about a local prostitute was something the band had performed casually together since their earliest days playing rowdy clubs in Hamburg and Liverpool, long before any of them had ever been signed to a proper record label or dreamed of the fame that awaited. Producer Phil Spector, brought in by Lennon in the spring of 1970 to salvage the troubled Let It Be, sessions after the recordings had sat largely unfinished and untouched for the better part of a year, included the brief, informal recording on the finished album, seemingly as a nostalgic nod back toward the band's scruffy early roots, capturing the group casually performing the old folk tune in a loose, unrehearsed studio jam, rather than presenting it as any kind of serious, polished recording in its own right.
And she never walked down Light Street anymore.
Because it barely qualifies as a proper, fully formed song at well under a minute in length, and carries no formal individual songwriting credit to any of the 4 members given its traditional folk origins passed down long before any of them were even born. It remains one of the most obscure and least remembered tracks the band ever officially released under their own name to record buyers. The song itself dates back generations as a piece of genuine traditional Liverpool folklore, with numerous other regional variations, verses, and competing lyrics existing long before the Beatles ever picked it up themselves during their formative years playing rough, working-class venues scattered around the Merseyside region of England, learning it the same way countless other local bands had before them. Even many longtime, dedicated fans working through the Let It Be album from start to finish for the first time are often genuinely surprised to learn this brief 40-second fragment even exists at all as an official, catalog-listed Beatles recording.
That dirty, no good loving Maggie Mae.
12 tracks that most casual Beatles fans have genuinely never heard in their lives, buried on B-sides nobody bothers flipping their record over for, tucked into deep album cuts most people skip straight past without a second thought, or locked away in a vault for decades before finally seeing the light of day many years later. Even the biggest band in the entire history of popular music left behind a small handful of recordings they'd probably just as soon have quietly forgotten about altogether, tucked away where only the most curious fans would ever go looking for them. If any of these songs were completely new to you, let us know which one surprised you the most down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed digging into the deepest, dustiest corners of the Beatles' catalog, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the music you thought you already knew inside and out.